Had the CTP done its job over the last decade, there should have been tobacco harm reduction products approved through the appropriate process.
If I may, tobacco harm reduction product is an industry term. Vaping, if combustible tobacco didn't exist, you'd be horrified by what's in the residue from vaping. When you think about that going into your lungs over the course of decades, it's pretty horrifying.
Congress enshrined harm reduction as a kind of a pillar in the 2009 Tobacco Control Act. Unfortunately, the Center for Tobacco Products' current leadership seems to have abandoned harm reduction as a foundational principle of its tobacco policy by refusing to authorize other tobacco products that have been pending before your agency for years. And if you have 900 cigarettes that have been approved and only a handful of vape or other products, that seems to be divergent. So in addition to vaping, you have other products like Zyn or something similar to that. Would you consider that to be a harm reduction product?
The term harm reduction tends to be used by industry to cover a lot of different areas.
Commissioner, in this hearing, you have said that the term harm reduction is an industry term or a term that industry uses. But to be clear, it's not just industry that uses this term. The Institute of Medicine uses it. And the concept of harm reduction has been embraced in other countries. That is, they accept and communicate that there are options that are less risky than a traditional cigarette. Are we ever going to get to that point in this country? Do you accept this idea?
Definitely accept the idea. Your point is well taken that industry is not the only entity to use it, but what I want to avoid, speaking of harm reduction, we've talked about combustible tobacco kills people. Neither using vaping or combustible tobacco is the healthiest thing you can do. Vaping, compared to none of the above, has residues that are quite concerning for long-term use. I'm just worried that when we use the term harm reduction now, it's often part of a vast advertising campaign.
Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. U.S. FDA Commissioner Robert Califf appeared before the powerful U.S. House Oversight and Accountability Committee last week to respond to charges that his agency is willfully slow-rolling approvals for safer nicotine products such as nicotine vapes, thus creating the conditions for millions of illicit disposable vapes from China to flood the U.S. market. As you witnessed moments ago in our cold open, there were a surprising number of mentions by committee members in support of tobacco harm reduction, and some very concerning responses from Commissioner Califf. Joining us today to unpack the hearing and its potential impact is Tony Abboud, Executive Director at the Vapor Technology Association. Tony, it's good to see you again.
Thank you, Brent. I appreciate having an opportunity to come on and chat with you.
There's a ton of material to go through today, but before we start, it's important to mention how much of this got started with an in-house review of the FDA's Center for Tobacco Products conducted by the Reagan-Udall Foundation, which we both discussed on RegWatch in depth during late 2022 and early 2023. The Foundation's report was damning, essentially finding that the CTP has not clearly set out the most basic elements of its tobacco and nicotine regulatory programs, resulting in confusion, inefficiency, litigation, and suspicions of political interference. Tony, when watching the hearings last week, was it clear that the Reagan-Udall report made an impact?
Unfortunately, no. It does not appear that Reagan-Udall's report has made an impact on the agency, either at the Center for Tobacco Products level or, unfortunately, at the commissioner's level. He did mention Reagan-Udall a couple of times, but only in response to pretty much how great they are doing in following the Reagan-Udall Foundation's recommendations. But as with most things, the devil is in the details, and the details in this case are that the agency has not responded to the most critical criticism of Reagan-Udall Foundation, which was specifically that the FDA, CTP, have not told manufacturers of e-cigarettes what is required to prove that the product is appropriate for the protection of public health. And they said that the CTP and FDA have not explained to the public how the agency is interpreting and applying the APPH standard. And that became very clear when you listen to the testimony of the commissioner, because he often referred to the public health standard, but then he basically made the public health standard up. The way that he articulates that public health standard, particularly in the context of harm reduction, makes clear that harm reduction is neither believed in by the agency nor is the agency committed to harm reduction, as he was pressed on by Representative Chairman Comer and also Representative Fry.
And we're going to definitely get to some of those clips. Let me ask you, you just said that Chairman Comer, he's Republican, right?
Correct.
And so did the majority of the questions that were pressing the commissioner, did they fall on party lines?
No, there seemed to be a uniform or a bipartisan disapproval of the general manner in which the FDA has managed tobacco policy. And I think that what is important to remember is that the issues are interrelated. But when it comes right down to it, what I heard throughout the testimony in response to all the questions is that this FDA, this commissioner, does not view e-cigarettes as a harm reduction product, nor does he view pouches, for example, as a harm reduction product, but rather is clearly focused on the elimination of nicotine altogether. He's clearly focused on eliminating any person in the United States from using a tobacco product that contains nicotine.
I got the same sense, Tony, as well. I've got a first set of bites here coming up from Rep. Virginia Fox, Republican from North Carolina. Let's have a listen.
Had the CTP done its job over the last decade, there should have been tobacco harm reduction products approved through the appropriate process. There's clearly a demand for these products that's being filled by illicit flavored disposable e-cigarettes, now make up more than 70% of the e-cigarettes or ends market, as my colleague is talking about, most of which are from China. What is the FDA doing to rectify this problem of illicit products in the market?
If I may, tobacco harm reduction product is an industry term. I'd say we're all in favor of reducing harm from tobacco. And as I went over with an earlier question, we have an increasing number of warning letters, civil money penalties, and injunctions now, and seizures now at ports of places of import. It is a very large number of products. There's no question about it. It is a big job, and we have a lot more work to do.
Tony, what did you make of that?
Well, obviously, Representative Fox is correct. The FDA has not done its job. The FDA has not filled the market with less harmful flavored and vaping products. Frankly, it hasn't filled the market with vaping products of any kind. And so, the FDA, whether it likes it or not, it has the responsibility to create markets. But the problem that we've had is that this FDA and past FDAs have taken it upon themselves to simply ignore the benefits, the scientifically demonstrated benefits of vaping, to declare that virtually all vaping products that exist today are illegal, whether you consider them to be illicit products that have come into the country and have ignored FDA regulations, or whether you consider those products that have gone through the PMTA process, or at least attempted to go through the PMTA process, only to find that their applications were effectively ignored. I think that the mass denial of applications that occurred in August and September and October of 2021, as a result of the then acting commissioner's decision that she wanted to remove all flavored products without a policy decision in place, behind closed doors, which we've talked about on prior programs and is very well documented. That was the first step towards the problem in the marketplace that the FDA, and it rests at the feet of the FDA. had the agency actually reviewed the science, had the agency taken into account all of the real world science, had the agency actually embraced harm reduction as the earlier predecessors, for example, Commissioner Gottlieb did when he laid out his strategic plan in 2017, we would be in a very different place today. But the problem is it did not do so. And the market reacted the way that markets react. And as a result of that, though, the narrative currently about we have to remove all illegal products really means that we need to ban all products. That is what they are asking for, because the FDA has stated unequivocally that any product that it has not authorized is illegal, and that there is no safe harbor for a product with a pending PMTA. If that is going to be the agency's position, then the agency has put itself in the position of enforcing a ban. Whether you want to call it a de facto ban or an actual ban, it does not matter, because their position is there are no products that can be legally sold in this country unless they are the handful of products on the list that they have published. And we know how small that list is.
Yeah. And Tony, isn't it the case that it may not be the FDA that's actually doing the banning, but by the publishing of that list and working with the states, and then, of course, the states are passing, some of them are passing these registry bills. It's kind of that trigger wire mechanism, which then the states are the ones that are actually doing the banning via the registry legislation.
Well, I think there's no question that the states have to be very careful in stepping into this arena, because it is a colossal mess for a state, particularly a conservative state, to be adopting a federal government's policy and process that courts have said is illegal. Raises serious questions for those state officials. Is this something you really want to step into? Do you want to become the enforcer of what the Fifth Circuit and what the 11th Circuit and what perhaps the Supreme Court in the coming year may say is an illegal process? Again, the FDA has visited these problems on itself, and as a result, on the United States and on the public health of the citizens of the United States. The reality is that, again, the FDA has been making political decisions. That was what was identified during the Reagan-Udall Foundation process. We saw the comments that were made by the employees of the Office of Science of how their scientific decisions were being overridden by leadership, which had a decidedly their own agenda. And that agenda was to eliminate flavored vaping products. So that process is the broken process, is the illegal process that everyone who is now calling for enforcement right now is talking about enforcing. And it's our contention that the FDA, for all of the wrongs that it has done in the past, should not be given a pass by virtue of the fact that it has now created effectively a gray market that it is now struggling to regulate. It can't regulate a ban. It's not authorized to implement a ban, but that is what it's doing.
Now, when you take a listen, I don't even think you need to take a close listen. It's pretty clear. Commissioner Califf does not have a very high opinion when it comes to nicotine vaping products. Let's have a listen to this quick soundbite.
The Center for Tobacco Products, I feel like they've continued to not tell the truth in some cases to the American people. They tell us that vaping is harmful or more harmful than cigarettes, yet Dr. Nancy Regotti of Harvard concluded U.S. health agencies and professional medical societies should reconsider their cautious position on e-cigarettes for quitting smoking. The burden of tobacco-related disease is too big for potential solutions, such as e-cigarettes, to be ignored. Is it more harmful than cigarettes if it's used if it's not abused?
Here's what I'd say. combustible tobacco kills people. I was just over in the UK because we're having a regulator meeting. I went to Oxford where Sir Richard Dahl did the British doctor study. The doctors who smoked died 10 years earlier than the ones who didn't. Vaping, if combustible tobacco didn't exist, you'd be horrified by what's in the residue from vaping. When you think about that going into your lungs
Sure.
over the course of decades, it's pretty horrifying. But it's much less toxic in terms of all the things that cause cancer and heart disease, the vaping, than the combustible tobacco. So that's why the term has been used, harm reduction, to say if you got someone using combustible tobacco, they're a lot better off if they're vaping, at least by those criteria. But compared to using neither, there's no question that there's no benefit of vaping other than if it helps you get off of combustible tobacco.
I don't know what's more horrifying, what he said or his overall general attitude during this hearing towards nicotine overall. He's got a problem with nicotine.
That answer was just illuminating. When in one breath he says that it is less harmful than cigarettes, but then he turns around and acts as if that's not the objective here, finding products that are less harmful than cigarettes. I mean, it is horrifying to think that the FDA commissioner is denying access to vaping products to Americans, even though he recognizes that, as he said, the only benefit of e-cigarettes is to get people off of combustible cigarettes. Well, I would suggest that's a pretty darn big benefit, not to mention the fact that it is the objective of the FDA, not to mention the fact that it was the central purpose of the Tobacco Control Act in the first instance. And that was called out by other members during the hearing. So I am just dumbstruck by this statement and the series of statements that are made, because it just suggests a complete commitment to a prohibition mindset. We have to get people to stop using any form of nicotine product, as opposed to, wouldn't it be better if they used a dramatically less harmful form of nicotine product rather than a combustible cigarette? So there is no logic to those statements because it doesn't fit within the mission of the FDA. It can only be attributed to a personal commitment or an agency policy, which of course has not been articulated, that all vaping products should be removed from the market, that there is no place in this country for a less harmful vaping product. That is extremely dangerous because you cannot express concern and worry about adults who are smoking and dying every single day in this country, as he does during this hearing, and then downplay the role that e-cigarettes may play in the fight to help reduce smoking.
Tony, there was a great exchange led by Representative Russell Fry, Republican from South Carolina, that brought up some very interesting and disturbing information with regard to the amount of combustible cigarettes that the FDA has approved onto the market, while at the same time denying, slow rolling, obfuscating anything to do with safer nicotine products. Let's have a listen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, thank you for being here. Congress enshrined harm reduction as a kind of a pillar in the 2009 Tobacco Control Act. The FDA's 2017 strategic plan embraced that harm reduction with the former FDA Commissioner noting that successfully implementing harm reduction could dwarf the introduction of any new medical technology and its positive impact on our public health. Unfortunately, the Center for Tobacco Products' current leadership under the Biden administration seems to have abandoned harm reduction as a foundational principle of its tobacco policy by refusing to authorize other tobacco products that have been pending before your agency for years. Your agency is failing to acknowledge the need for real change to provide better options for 28 million American smokers. A recent study from Yale University found that for every 0.7 milliliters of e-cigarette e-liquid that goes unsold due to flavor restrictions, 15 additional cigarettes are sold. It was also found that e-cigarette flavor restrictions in place for at least a year yielded 20% increases in sales of cigarette brands disproportionately used by underage smokers. Can you explain why the FDA and the CTP have authorized 900 new cigarettes in the time that it has authorized only a handful of vapor products?
First of all, we haven't abandoned the principle that you described, but it's a little more complicated than that. It's a responsibility of the company to produce a data set that shows that the benefits of smoking, of combustible tobacco reduction exceed the risks due to getting teenagers addicted. Vaping products get people addicted to nicotine if it's a new user. So we've always got to balance that risk of getting millions of teenagers addicted to the benefit to adults with combustible tobacco. So there are 23 products now on the market that have met that standard, and other companies are welcome to submit their data and produce the data showing that they meet that public health standard.
Does CTP still believe in the continuum of risk of nicotine products, and does the FDA think it's helpful for adult smokers who would otherwise continue smoking cigarettes to switch from combustible cigarettes to smoke-free alternatives? Yes or no?
There's not a yes or no answer to that, because for adults, the best thing to do is to stop using tobacco products altogether. The second best would be to switch to a vape, but the very best would be to be, as we already discussed, if you look at the residue from vaping relative to no use of any tobacco product, it's, raises a number of issues over the long.
I think the concern that I have, sir, and I think the concern that many people share is that there seems to be an abandonment of a congressional, not only intent, a directive that we're going to pursue harm reduction as an actual strategy in the country. And if you have 900 cigarette that have been approved and only a handful of vape or other products, that seems to be divergent to what Congress has outlined for your agency. Would you not agree with that?
I'm not familiar with the 900 term set. I have to go back and look at that. But we have not abandoned the idea that the company should show that it can successfully transition people from combustible tobacco to vaping in a way which does not increase the risk to teenagers of getting addicted to nicotine and therefore being susceptible to switching to tobacco.
So in addition to vaping, you have other products like Zyn or something similar to that. Would you consider that to be a harm reduction product?
We discussed this early. The term harm reduction tends to be used by industry to cover a lot of different areas, but if there's a product that can cause someone to stop using combustible tobacco and not get teenagers addicted to nicotine, that's a benefit.
So there it is in a nutshell. The entire appropriate for the protection of public health is measured on whether or not teenagers will get addicted to nicotine. Not that they'll smoke to get addicted to nicotine. I'm not certain where that's written down anywhere. Has that benchmark ever been actually put pen to paper?
Well, it's a perverse interpretation of the public health standard that's set out in the Tobacco Control Act. This has been the problem from the outset. The agency didn't, as the Fifth Circuit said, the agency didn't tell companies what was required for demonstrating that they meet the public health standard. The agency hasn't told us exactly how they are interpreting it, unless you listen to these comments. And now with these comments, we hear, as we've seen in the past with their en masse denial of all flavored vaping products, if there is any risk to teens or initiation by young people, then they will not examine the question of whether adults quit. That is the problem with the position that the commissioner laid out during the hearing. He pretends as if the agency has been fully evaluating each and every product to determine if that product was helpful in helping people reduce smoking and whether that product itself was causing others to initiate, or even if they're young people. It doesn't have to be limited to young people according to the public health standard, but all they focus on is, of course, young people. What's critical, though, is it's not a nicotine determination, and yet he consistently refers to nicotine. The question is, are they going to start using other tobacco products? And this concept of being addicted to nicotine, which is obviously not as material of an issue as it might have been in 2019 when we had youth vaping at its peak, is irrelevant to this commissioner. And so it is astounding, again, to listen to that back and forth between Representative Fry and the commissioner. You cannot say that you believe in harm reduction and then say it doesn't matter whether adults might switch to a less harmful product, vaping products, if that product may also cause some other people to initiate using that product. And then if those people, particularly young people, might become addicted to nicotine, and then sometime in the future might ultimately start matriculating to other forms of more dangerous tobacco products. I would tell you that, I mean, there's just no evidence of a gateway. That's been disproven for years. And so the fact that the commissioner and the CTP cling to this standard, that we have to be more concerned about some potential hypothetical future risk than we do about the adults that are suffering, 8 million adults who are suffering from smoking-related diseases this year and next year and the year after, and the 480,000 that will die because of it, just shows a complete disconnect from reality. And it's just really, it's really unfortunate. It's a sad place that we have gotten to with respect to the discussion of harm reduction, because it appears that harm reduction in his mind means ending all use, which is not harm reduction, that's harm elimination. And so it would, obviously, the goal would always be to move from a dangerous product to a much less harmful product to no use at all. But if you are going to ignore that second step, the true harm reduction step, then you cannot in one breath say that you are committed to harm reduction and in the next breath make the statements that the commissioner made.
Tony, we hear from regulators and politicians all the time that they will not tolerate another generation of young people to become addicted to nicotine. But we never hear them say, we will not tolerate another generation of young people to get addicted to heroin or to alcohol or to cannabis or social media or porn. I mean, the list is endless, but way more disturbing than nicotine. What's going on in their brains?
Well, you know, there has been this historic fear of the tobacco industry. Obviously, cigarette companies left this country with a very tawdry reputation. There's no question that the discussion has gone from now vaping to anti-pouches to anti-nicotine. And it is not only just a slippery slope, it is a fast-moving train now. Because of the narrative that has been spun out, both inside the industry and outside the industry. So, you know, we have harm reduction, which is used in response to every public health crisis, which is why when the commissioner says that's an industry term, that's obviously just tone deaf to what public health groups around the country for generations have relied upon to address things like the opioid epidemic, like the fentanyl epidemic, right? We have hundreds of thousands of deaths in this country because of fentanyl pill overdoses. And the public health response is to encourage harm reduction, not to tell people stop using it altogether, like the commissioner is demanding of all things tobacco, but to use it safely, to use it and be educated, to not be shamed or don't feel shame for using fentanyl, a dangerous opioid and an illegal drug. The response from public health communities in red states and in blue states has been to encourage people to use the products in a safer fashion. Now, that disconnect is pure hypocrisy when considered in terms of tobacco harm reduction. And the fact that the commissioner repeatedly refers to this as an industry term, he should probably go back and look at the role that harm reduction has played in public health in virtually every other context for what are illegal drugs as opposed to what is a legal product, which is a nicotine product.
I think you may be a bit kind there, Tony, because I think he and other members of public health and tobacco control know all too well what they're doing when they're saying that, tobacco harm reduction is an industry term. As you just said, the tobacco industry has a horrible reputation in the United States and other countries around the world for what they perpetrated on the public. And so by connecting tobacco harm reduction as an industry plot, so to speak, they're maligning tobacco harm reduction by saying that it's an industry term. And it's not just in the US. I think it's a larger campaign by tobacco control to deceive lawmakers and the public. For several months, we've been tracking this effort globally. I have two clips for us, one from a WHO internal webinar just prior to COP10 in Panama, where WHO reps discuss industry-funded tobacco harm reduction as front groups. So tobacco harm reduction front groups. And the other clip is from a recent interview I did with Cliff Douglas, the former vice president of tobacco control from the American Cancer Society, and now president and CEO of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. Let's have a listen.
I think there's definitely a step up in the interference and pressure on the COP by the tobacco industry. I think it's better organized now in terms of mobilizing its front groups. Its front groups have become far more aggressive now than they ever were before. And also all the research that has been funded and also groups that have been funded by the Foundation for Smoke-Free World. I think that the groups, the front groups have become bolder also because previously, it was fewer tobacco control countries, parties that are strong in tobacco control. There were very few actually who embraced e-cigarettes, but now there are more of them. And I think this has empowered both the industry as well as the front groups to do more. I want to point out that the Article 5.3 guidelines also includes individuals that work to further the interests of the tobacco industry. So it's not just the tobacco industry, but individuals who further their interests. And in this case, I want to point out the harm reduction front groups who have been attacking the COP. And they are both organizations as well as individuals, and they work to further the interests of the industry.
Well, tobacco harm reduction, people refer to it as THR, 3 letters that for too many people have become a 4-letter word or reference. Well, tobacco harm reduction has increasingly, if anything, been associated by folks who just feel differently or see the world differently for the various reasons they do than some folks like myself. They have tabbed tobacco harm reduction as an industry plot. But what's happened is that the notion that we apply that concept, that tried and true and very effective public health approach to tobacco products, has gotten conflated with the suspicion and the, in some ways, unique and very troubling history involving the tobacco industry. And I think that some of my good friends and colleagues from my tobacco control community have found it difficult, therefore, to countenance the involvement in any way of that industry in promoting the availability of harm reduction for tobacco. But here's the deal. The deal is that what we call tobacco harm reduction is dedicated to saving lives. It isn't an industry plot. I would also ask some folks, by the way, if you do trust in at least the concept of reducing harm from smoking, the leading preventable cause of death, and it's going to involve the use of alternative products that will work for people and enable them when they need it, when they aren't finding other options, either accessible or appealing or just effective for them to be able to wean themselves using alternative products. Who do you think is going to make them? It's going to be the industry that's equipped to do that.
The words speak for themselves. The WHO representative was obviously laying out the argument that the groups that unfortunately are closely tied to public health infrastructure have been trying to perpetuate. And the focus is on the notion that these front groups, so-called, are perpetuating the harm reduction narrative is one thing. But the reality is the narrative is based on science. And that is what is at the core of the entire harm reduction argument. There wouldn't be a harm reduction argument for tobacco if the science wasn't so clear that e-cigarettes are dramatically less harmful than combustible cigarettes. And so, being locked into a political battle, being locked into an institutional battle, if that's the where they choose to play, then they will play on that field. But it still is not based on science. You can point to any group that raises the importance of the science that is clearly now on one side, which is that e-cigarettes are a dramatic tool for harm reduction, if not outright smoking cessation. And they don't want to talk about those issues. The folks that are opposed to e-cigarettes or opposed to industry really don't want to talk about the science, because if they did, they wouldn't have as much to say.
Now, I want us to get back to that issue of FDA approving combustible tobacco products, but just one more detour before that, because relative risk is the issue when it comes to harm reduction products. And it seems that FDA has a real problem with adopting a true program when it comes to relative risk. But just 2 days ago, right here in April, just a couple of days after the hearing, FDA releases a brand new website and with a paper all about the relative risks of tobacco products. But if you read this carefully, it's not very supportive about relative risk at all. I wanted your feedback on what FDA is doing here.
Well, I think what you were teasing out there at the beginning is interesting, right? This website gets launched, within 5 days after the commissioner just gets beaten up in front of the House Oversight Committee for not being committed to harm reduction. So this is the FDA's next effort to demonstrate that they believe in the facts, they believe in the science, that they believe in the continuum of risk. Here's the problem. When you look at this new website, the term harm reduction appears 0 times on the website. And if you read their statements, again, I give them credit for, in some places, for actually stating facts, but when they state those facts, everything is still colored in this whole concept that you shouldn't use anything. No tobacco product is safe. No tobacco. Everything should be couched in the realm of quitting everything altogether. It's an unrealistic end. And so again, if they were committed to harm reduction, then this website would have encouraged people to use e-cigarettes, to quit smoking, to try to quit smoking. But they stop so far short of that. It's just really, again, reflects a sad state of affairs. I view this website as kind of a begrudging effort by the FDA to address this issue, which is becoming much more difficult for them to deal with because of the types of questions that they are now receiving from members of Congress.
Yes, and God bless those members of Congress who are, putting those questions in front of the FDA. Let me ask you, if the FDA is really concerned with tobacco harm reduction of any sort, relative risk of any sort, would they or would they not then stop approving new cigarettes for the marketplace? Tell us about what you've found in terms of the number of cigarettes that they've approved just in the last short 3-4 years.
Yeah, well, I was pleased to see that the statistics that we reported on back in March of last year, we issued a report, you can find it on our website, about the FDA's dangerous authorization of 1,200 combustible products, including almost 900 new cigarettes and only a handful of e-cigarettes. So I was glad that a couple members of the committee actually made reference to the fact that the agency has been authorizing new cigarettes. The reality is that it has actually gotten worse, and we're unfortunately going to be having to update this report. If you look at the new data that the FDA has just released, the new data shows that the FDA has authorized 1,500 new cigarettes in the last 5 years, hundreds of which were authorized under Brian King's leadership in 2023 alone. And the number of other combustible products exceed 10,000. So it does beg the question, what is the agency doing? On the one hand, it's acting as if they want people to quit smoking. It's acting as if they cannot possibly give adults other less harmful tools to help them quit smoking because they want them to stop everything altogether. And they are flooding the market with combustible products. 662 new cigarettes in 2023 alone. And yet, 0 vaping products, 0 flavored vaping products, 0 pouches. It is an absurd upside down world in which they are living. And for the commissioner not to know that his agency authorized 900 new cigarettes in the 4-year period between 2019 and 2022, that is a sad fact, but it is a fact. And he should know how bad the record is with respect to the FDA authorizing cigarettes and other combustible products when viewed in light of the fact that it has, as Representative Fry said, authorized only a handful of vaping products. It is an absurd reality, but it is our reality.
It is quite stunning, the fact on either side. If the commissioner did know, then why in the hell didn't he do something about it? And is he okay with that? All the new combustible cigarettes being put on the market. If he didn't know, well, why doesn't he know? That sounds like something that he should know about. It's just actually astonishing. Look, we're going to switch here to cannabis because that also came up a few times in the hearing. And I think there's a bit of a dichotomy in terms of the kind of language the commissioner was using. Let's dive into this one here.
Thank you. If the DEA concurs with the FDA's recommendation, can you help me understand if the FDA will take on additional responsibilities or if your role will change as it relates to cannabis?
This is a very complicated topic, but I'll just say that cannabis, remember there are over 30 different forms of cannabis now, different chemicals that are made, and it falls in this area where state regulation has been dominant. This is an area where I believe we would be better off if we had guidance from Congress about how to proceed, because we're not, medical marijuana is one thing where there's a medical purpose and it's proven through traditional medical pathways, but when it's used for recreational purposes, there is no medical benefit in that case, so it doesn't fall under our typical regulation. But what's in play with this and several other things that I think we'll probably talk with the chairman about here shortly, like CBD, the question is, how do we reduce harm that's done when it's used inappropriately or at a dose which is dangerous, or when it's packaged in a way to market it specifically to children. We're seeing some of this stuff packaged in gummy bears that easily mistaken for children's candy. But we're going to need help in a regulatory pathway, remembering that almost everything we do is there's a health benefit, like you create a new drug or a new device or a food for a health benefit. This is an area of harm reduction when it's used recreationally.
It just shows that there is no belief in harm reduction, not because he doesn't believe in harm reduction, because he refuses to apply it to the tobacco space. The notion that the commissioner says for recreational cannabis, we need to have harm reduction as part of our strategy with respect to an illegal drug, right? Federally, it is illegal. Is again astounding when you think about it in terms of the manner in which he deflected the harm reduction concept in the case of tobacco. And it's just, again, demonstrates that there is no consistency, internal consistency in their position on this issue. You cannot say that you believe in harm reduction in a recreational cannabis concept and that it should be a central component of their regulatory strategy, and then turn around and deflect and diminish harm reduction in the tobacco space when you know cigarettes are killing people today and tomorrow and the next day.
We certainly didn't hear the commissioner say, we're not going to approve any marijuana products if they potentially could be used by young people, or if they might get young people addicted to pot. None of that stuff. That language isn't there. It's all, like you said, so, well, maybe recreational marijuana, and, we can use it as a harm reduction strategy. To me, it's mind-boggling.
I think, Brent, the reality is that teen use of cannabis products is higher today than teen use of vaping products. Yet the concept of harm reduction with respect to tobacco is anathema because some teens may try to vape. He doesn't think about it in the context of what would the teens be doing if they weren't vaping nicotine? Would they be smoking? Right? Very possible. And very likely, at least with a portion of the population. But this constant refrain that he goes back to with respect to addiction, with respect to nicotine and how dangerous addiction is, he just kind of just disavows it and acts as if it's not a real issue with respect to cannabis. Otherwise, why would the agency, the FDA, publish a recommendation to deschedule cannabis when he knows in the recreational construct, it already is causing higher and higher teen use. And so the fact that harm reduction somehow can apply to a recreational cannabis regulatory strategy, but does not apply to tobacco harm reduction in the tobacco context, just displays either a callous disregard for smokers or a complete cognitive dissonance with respect to public health issues writ large.
So I have one more clip from the hearing. Again, it's with regard to cannabis, and I think it's definitely worth a listen. Here we go.
This body in the 1990s recognized that the tobacco industry had worked to increase the amount of nicotine in tobacco. Nicotine is not the carcinogenic that caused people to get lung cancer. It's the smoke, the tar, and the other things from inhaling the smoke. You have some of the same issues with marijuana. What concerns me right now is that we're not doing anything, to my knowledge, to regulate what's going on in the marijuana industry, and particularly the genetically modified products. In the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, as I reminded my colleagues, THC content was about 2%. Now it's anywhere from 17 to 28%. And that's the addictive part of marijuana that affects the frontal lobe, that impacts judgment. And what we're starting to see now, again, it comes in different forms. You don't just smoke it. You could take it as a gummy. You could get it as an oil. And what's happening is more and more children are coming in contact with it. In terms of addiction, 9% of those people who just experiment with it become addicted. 17% of those who start as teenagers become addicted, and anywhere from 25 to 50% of daily users. Is that another area where the FDA needs to engage, because we see more and more states legalizing this, so it's not a DEA problem, it's a consumer problem.
I believe that this is a similar area where harm reduction through a regulatory strategy is probably our best approach, and we need more research on exactly what the facts are. I remember that the tobacco industry was engaging in genetic manipulation, basically going way back, just through the old-fashioned Mendelian radiation of the plant and then development of mutations that would lead to more and more nicotine in the product. And now we have chemical synthesis, which can imitate almost any of these in a highly efficient way to produce the kind of effects that you described. So
increase addiction.
We're concerned, and we'd like to see a regulatory pathway, but we talked earlier about the fact, for the most part, the FDA is a referee, and we need a rule book, and you guys write the rule book. So we'd really like to see a rule book in this area.
Tony, the commissioner does seem to completely, totally do everything he can to avoid talking about the addiction of cannabis.
He ignored that question, part of the question entirely, and pivoted to talking about the tobacco industry again. What's, again, stunning is you heard the words come out of his mouth, that harm reduction needs to be the central part of a regulatory strategy for cannabis. And, we discussed this just a bit ago, and he cannot bring himself to say the same thing. Like, he could make that exact same statement and end it with tobacco or with nicotine. It wouldn't matter to me. But he won't make that statement. He won't make harm reduction a central part of the agency's strategy. And the net result, of course, is that more people will continue to smoke. More people will be concerned about the dangers of vaping products, because the agency is not speaking clearly about the benefits of vaping. He's talking about how horrifying vaping is. You can't do both, right? And I think they're trying to walk a line, and I don't know what is at the end of that line, because they don't seem to have a direction other than, we just need everybody to stop using any form of tobacco product. That is not a realistic regulatory strategy, and yet it appears to be the direction in which they are headed.
Now, FDA did get rule book kind of marching orders from Congress when it came to tobacco and their regulation of tobacco products, but yet they're not really following that. That point was made by one of the congressmen earlier in the hearing, was the fact that harm reduction is actually written in the Tobacco Control Act.
Yeah, I was taken aback by clearly the commissioner's staff gave him a theme for this hearing, and because he repeated that notion of FDA is just the referee, Congress, you write the rules, and we just kind of, call balls and strikes. He came back to that a number of times, but of course, that is just not the reality. Period. It just isn't. In this case, in the tobacco case, the FDA wrote the rule book. It was 550 pages long. So it wrote the rules for PMTA. It applied those rules before they were final to reject virtually all the products. It changed the rules after the game had started, to extend his analogy. And then it was found to have not even followed the rules. So it is a narrative, which is an interesting narrative, that they are just a referee, that they're just kind of this benign side player that's calling balls and strikes. No, they make the rules, they enforce the rules, and unfortunately, actually more accurately, I should say, they make the rules and then they choose how they want to enforce the rules so that it achieves whatever current purpose they are trying to achieve. The notion that they make the rules and then authorize hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of new cigarettes and use the rules to eliminate all vaping products. You don't need to know anything more than that to say that whatever the system is that they think they're enforcing or that they're applying is broken.
Tony, do you think it's possible that the walls could be closing in on the FDA finally? Is there any reason we can think that?
Well, clearly they are worried about litigation because the commissioner brought up litigation in numerous contexts in terms of how they're struggling to enforce the rules, whether they're talking about enforcing against a marketplace that's filled with products that are not addressing the FDA's regulations, or if they're talking about their slowness or their inability to authorize PMTAs. He constantly referred to how many applications were filed, and he kind of got away with his 26 million applications because the reality is they got rid of all of those, the majority of those applications without doing any substantive review. He was questioned heavily about the fact that they staffed up heavily before the PMTA process. They've received so much money from Congress to do their job, and they haven't done their job. So clearly, he wants to focus on finding issues that he and Congress can agree on, which is how can they do a better job. But the reality is the agency needs to be held accountable for the illegal conduct that it has engaged in that is now at issue in the courts. And I think that they are stuck, frankly. They say that they are going to review and opine and make decisions on all the outstanding PMTAs by June. They said that recently. But the reality is they are in litigation. So their action can only be in one direction. They can only deny every flavored application because their flavored application review process was called illegal by the Fifth Circuit, and the FDA has asked the Supreme Court to take on that case. So there's nothing they can do in the interim because it will mess with their legal strategy and the opinions and the positions that they need to take in that litigation. But what's most concerning, just as a final point, it is dangerous to hear the commissioner say a couple things that he said today when he was before the Appropriations Committee. One thing that he said was, flavored vaping products have no health benefit, period. When he was quoted the science last week by Representative Fry about how the removal of flavored vaping products from the market, according to Abigail Friedman's study, actually leads to an increase in cigarette sales. Again, there is just an internal refusal to acknowledge the role that vaping products, and particularly flavored vaping products, have in helping adults quit smoking. And if he is not committed to helping adults quit smoking, I don't know what job it is that he thinks that the Center for Tobacco Products is supposed to do.